Hi everyone, my name is Danielle and this channel is called A View from the South. In this channel we are going to talk about sustainable development and climate change from a perspective of someone that comes from the South. Today we are going to talk about what sustainable development is. I think that despite this commitment of the UN Assembly to improve the people's life standards and improve human rights, we cannot see in the UN Declaration of Human Rights any mention to environmental rights, to environmental issues. The environment became actually an issue in the 1960s when it happens a series of natural disasters and as well a series of environmental accidents that spike the awareness of people about around the environmental issues. I will just mention a few of them here in this video for you to have a dimension of the impact of the environmental issues during that decade. I think the first one is the pea soup fog that happened in London in 1962. I think this event killed around 150 people because of the air pollution. The second event that I will mention is the coal mine fire that just collapsed the town of Abergavenny in Wales in 1967. It killed at the time 116 people, 116 children and 28 adults. This event is portrayed in the season 3 of the series The Crown, and it was what basically happens during this event. All the coal mine just collapsed over a school in that town, killing basically entire generations of kids that used to live in that town. I think the third event that also happened during that decade is the canyon, like an oil tanker that just spilled oil over the English Channel. Going outside of just the UK, I would also like to make how the entire Europe continent was basically shocked with a mass fishing poisoning that happens in the Rhine River. In the US, we have oil spill off in Santa Barbara, killing more than 3,500 seabirds. We also have oil spilled off in a river in Ohio, and as well other events around the world, as for example the Sahel droughts. Today we listen quite a lot about the Sahel droughts happening in Kenya, happening in Ethiopia, but was the first time we have the dimension of these droughts, and they happen more often since the 70s in an area where people already experience poverty, and loads of these events that becoming more often just basically drag people to famine. Example of natural disaster that also happened in the 60s was the basically the kill of 2,265 people in Japan because of intoxication with mercury. A company basically dropped this toxin in the Yanamata Bay, and the people that used to fish in that region consumed the fishing from that region of the sea was basically intoxicated by mercury and died. Today we know the disease caused by mercury intoxications as Minamata disease because of this event. Apart from all these disasters that happened during the 70s, we can also see the rise of environmental awareness. I would like to mention the publication of the book of a marine biologist and writer called Rachel Carson. I think at the time she published um, a book called The Silent Spring, where she for the use of pesticides in agriculture. I think this book was very influential at the time, despite today we don't talk much about this book or about like Rachel Carson, but I think this book changed the government regulations in the US, banning the use of DDT. And I think this scientist, she was very influential on the rise of like environmental movements in the US. I think the last event I would like to mention is not like necessarily environmental disaster or something related to the environment, but it changed massively our perception on our planet. And I think it's the Apollo 11 travel to the moon. Was the first time where people could see Earth from outside the Earth and could see how precious, how limited are the resources we have. And I think it changed our perception on our planet and our perception on nature. And I think this event was fundamental to actually wake people for the environmental issues, for the necessity to protect nature. This period was also marked by the struggle of many countries to free themselves from the colonization, and the end of the 60s, 1960s to 1979, we have a period in the Cold War called as Detente. The Detente was a period where the tensions between the US and the USSR were eased. So with the end of of the Vietnam War, we have a kind of period of peace between these two countries. And I think the Swedish government at the time enjoy, I think, the window of opportunity given by the Detente to raise the environmental issue, the environmental agenda and the development agenda in the global stage. In 1967, Sweden just proposed to convene a UN conference on human environment. And I think at the beginning, it's funny to think about Sweden, why Sweden is the first country to raise the environmental issue in the global agenda. I think it's something that we can probably discuss in more detail in another video. We also have today like the figure of Greta Thunberg that basically represents the youth, and she's also Swedish. And I think like Sweden is a very interesting country for us to think about public opinion on environment. But I think this proposal initially was well accepted by most of the countries, including countries from the Soviet bloc and countries of the Western Europe. I think the only two countries from Western Europe that didn't accept well the proposal at the beginning was the UK and France. I think they were fearing that the ex-colonies would request from their financial assistance to support like environmental protection. And from the side of the developing countries, they think that discuss like environmental issues would block their development in this post-colonial period. But a part of these concerns, I think the conference was carried out by Sweden. In May 1969, the UN General Assembly just accepted the offer from Sweden to hold like a conference in Stockholm. This conference would not take any decision initially. All the proposals that were made in the conference would be just taken as a recommendations by the country, and would not generate any obligations from the countries that participate in the conference. I think in the end, like none of the Soviet bloc countries participate in the conference, because like the East German participation was not allowed. But the conference was well attended, and basically 113 out of 132 countries participate in the conference. We have like the participation of two state leaders. We have the participation from India that participate in the conference represent like the group of developing countries. She was very clear in stating like the developing countries' priorities and the developing countries' fears around like the environmental issues, and as well the Prime Minister of Sweden at the time, Palme. Apart from these like institutional or this state representations in the conference, we also have 250 like international organizations that participate in the conference. I think from my point of view, I think the participation of the international organizations in the conference was important to show like the civil society support this initiative. And I think was very important as a first step or as a first initiative to be well received by the public, show the civil society was engaged on this subject. I think the three main outputs of this Stockholm conference was the Stockholm Declaration. I think the Stockholm Declaration was basically a set of principles that would guide the discussions ahead about the environmental issues. The second one is the action plan, the Stockholm Action Plan. They would bring like 109 recommendations around how countries should deal or should build like action plans on environmental management. I think most of the recommendations went around like researching, monitoring of the environmental issues or environmental degradation, and also like how to manage the environment. So this declaration was like were just recommendations, as I said. None of the proposals there would like generate obligations to the countries that signed the declaration. The last action or the last output of the conference was a group of 5 resolutions. The first one was the ban of like radioactive tests to avoid like a fallout in terms of radioactivity. It's funny to think that these outputs of the conference came out in 1972, basically 14 years before the main nuclear disasters in the world, that's the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And so at that time it was already a worry. The use of radioactivity was already a worry. I assume because of like the expansion of the nuclear weapons and the disaster that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the Second World War. I don't think at the time people think about the use of like the nuclear energy as an issue, but it's interesting to think that they were already thinking about that at the time. I think the second resolution was the creation of an international database on environment. What's quite surprising for me at the time. I think the people think more systematically on the tracking or the monitoring of the monitoring of the environmental issues. I think the third one that's central to our subject here, or the theme of this video, is the creation of the link between environment and development. So since the beginning they had this preoccupation of create an agenda that link both environment and development. And I think it was important the participation of Indira Gandhi in the conference because of that. Maybe if she was not there representing the interests of developing countries, this nexus between environment and development would never become part of the agenda. So I think like her participation was really important at the time. And I think like the fourth resolution was the creation of like a UN environmental agents that later become well known as UNP. And I think like the creation of the agents with a specific mandate was essential for this environmental, for the sustainability. I will use the word I will explain next. The sustainability of the agenda, the environmental agenda in the global stage, and the creation of a fund to maintain the activities of the UN agents that we know as UNEP. It's one curiosity about the UNEP is that they use the logo of the conference in Stockholm is the logo of the agent. So it was like a curiosity that I think probably you may want to know. There are 3 principles in the declaration, the Stockholm Declaration, that are the foundations of what we know today as sustainable development. The 3 principles. The 3rd principle is the principle that talk about the renewable resource should be maintained and wherever possible improved and restored. The principle 5 talk about the use of no renewable resource. They should be used in a way that they are guarded to future generations. So they should be avoid its exhaustion. So the renewable resource should be managed and used in a way to avoid its exhaustion, to make the future generations enjoy these no renewable resources as well. So we should manage the waste of our industrial activity to avoid like harm to the environment, is what the principle 6 means. I think all these 3 principles together, they bring a very valuable and the foundations, the seeds of what we later would call sustainable development, because all these articles, they talk about the preservation of the resources to be used for future generations, the preservation of the environment. I think it's like a rational management of the environment to allow like the present and the future generations to enjoy the environment in the same way, to enjoy the economic opportunities given by the environment. Is a way, as the Amartya say, would state, allow present and future generations to enjoy freedom. I think despite the efforts made in the Stockholm conference, nothing of substantial having been done after 10 or 12 years after the conference. Basically, both like developed, high-income developed country as well, low-income developing countries, they don't want to give up their economic growth to allow environmental preservation. They continue to just spill of pollution in the environment that cause like air pollution, acid rain, deforestation, desertification, and they still just spill off several toxic substances in the environment. So basically, after the Stockholm conference, business was run as usual and anything changed. I think the first time the word sustainable development, or this terminology sustainable development, was used in a political document was in 1998. And this document is called World Conservation Strategy, Living Resource Conservation for Sustainable Development. I think this document was written by an organization called the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, and this document was commissioned by both WWF and UNEP. Despite the effort of the UNEP and both WWF to commission this document, I think this document was not read by anyone, or stay very restricted to this community of like NGOs and the UNEP or other environmental agencies. I think like this document didn't help to popularize, I think, the concept of like the sustainable development. However, the concept was already there and better developed than it was before in the Stockholm Declaration. I think in this document, this World Conservation Strategy, sustainable development is seen as something that can be achieved when ecological processes are preserved and inequality are reduced in the process of modifying the biosphere. So they see like the economic activities and industrial activities as a way to, as a process that modify the biosphere to produce services and goods for human consumption. If like this process can reduce its impact or preserve the ecological process and as well reduce the inequality, it is understood or it is seen as the sustainable development was achieved. In this report, sustainable development was an objective, was not seen as a process. 3 years after the publication of the World Conservation Strategy report, I think Javier Pérez de Cuellar, that was a Peruvian diplomat and politician, and at the time was serving as the General Secretary of the United Nations, appointed Gro Harlem Brundtland, Minister of Norway, Prime Minister in Norway, as well Minister of Environment in this country, as the chairperson of the Commission on Environment and Development. This commission became well known by Brundtland Commission, and I think the main objective of the Brundtland Commission was to publish a report on strategies to achieve sustainable development. This document took basically 900 days to be prepared, and the title of the document is Our Common Future. In the end of the day, the document was not like well known by its name and became known as like Brundtland Report. I think, and it was in the first time where the concept sustainable development was popularized. I think the reason why the sustainable development was popularized, the terminology sustainable development was popularized in this document, because it involved like members of several states, basically 21 member states of the UN participate or contribute to this document. And I think this document like link basically government entities and non-government entities, which include like business leaders that were called to contribute with proposals to promote sustainable development by the year of 2000 and beyond. I think this document was also well known as a global agenda for change, and I think it was very important that the strategy to involve not just government leaders, but not just people that is related to sustainable, to the environmental agenda. I think like bring like a broad group of people from different areas to contribute to this report is what makes this report like a real success, different from the report that was first commissioned by the UNEP and the WWF. According to this report, like sustainable development was conceptualized as development that allow people to meet their present needs without compromising the future generation to meet their own needs. So I think like it was much more a simple and a much more effective way to conceptualize like sustainable development. Sustainable development is a goal as well is like part of the process. I think this simple concept we can unfold a little bit more this concept, trying to explain that this sustainable development requires a redistribution of the resources, including in the present, because the people to allow everyone, including the poor, to have resources to meet their own needs. I think in this report was also very clear the people from developed countries need to reduce their consumption standards or change their consumption standards because they were consuming above what was sustainable for the planet. And I think the third axis of this development strategy is a reorientation of the investments or the technological changes, I would say a redirection of political redirection of the technology investments. So we need to create a new era of growth based on a more sustainable technologies and the better use of the resources. In a way we can use the renewable resources in a more sustainable way. So I would say it's the beginning or the seeds, what we call today green investments. I think at the time they already state the concerns around the type of technology the humanity was producing, and that we need to change these technological patterns to allow sustainable development or to create a new era of growth based on technology that don't pollute the environment. After the publication of this, the release of this report in 1987, the commission was dissolved. But I think this, after this report was the fundamental stone, where never again environmental issues were not linked with poverty, with inequality. So sustainable development as a whole includes this dimension of this economic dimension that aim to reduce inequality and allowing a more sustainable economic growth, and also the protection of the environmental process, the preservation of the environmental process. In 1992 we have a new UN conference on environment. I think UN conference was called World Summit or Rio 92, and it's funny because its official name is UN Conference on Environment and Development. And 10 years later we also have in Johannesburg a conference that was called World Summit on Sustainable Development. Never again the development left the environmental agenda. And it's very funny to think that the two concepts are so connected in the global agenda around the environment. So it was my contribution to explain actually what sustainable development is. And if you like this video, give a thumbs up, and don't forget also to subscribe. And if you want to make any comments to this video to help us to improve the content of the channel or giving your suggestions, please write your comments below, and see you next time.